I was on a hunting trip that I had planned for months. It was fall, and the cold days were perfect for the season. I always liked doing this alone, more out of habit than anything else. When I'm in the woods, just me and the sound of my own footsteps, my head seems to clear up. Sure, hunting requires patience, but for me, it's more about being there, in that silence, than just the act of hunting itself. This time, I chose an area near an old forest in northern Montana. It was a place known for its density, few trails, and wildlife that hadn't been fully explored. Perfect for someone wanting to get away from the world for a few days. I drove the Jeep as far as the road allowed. The place was isolated enough that I didn't have to worry about tourists or any other kind of interruption. When the terrain got too rough to keep driving, I parked. From there, it would be all on foot. I like walking through terrain like that, full of elevations and obstacles, because I know most people wouldn't have the courage or the energy to do the same. After getting out of the Jeep, I checked my gear. Loaded gun, backpack with what I needed for a day out, and of course I checked my phone. No service. That was expected. I prefer it that way anyway. In nature, disconnecting from the rest of the world is what makes sense. I made a mental note of the exact location of the Jeep and moved forward. The plan was to find a good observation spot, maybe on top of some elevation or near a clearing, where I could watch the animals moving. It had been a while since I traveled to such a remote area, so I was excited to see what would show up. As I walked, the sound of dry leaves cracking under my boots was the only noise I could hear. The forest seemed dead at first glance, but we know it's just a matter of time before things reveal themselves. About an hour later, I started noticing signs of life, fresh footprints, broken branches. I was close, but one thing was bothering me, and it was the silence. Normally, even in dense forests, you can hear the sound of birds or some distant animal. But there, nothing. Not a peep. I forced myself to ignore the discomfort. After all, it was an isolated forest. Maybe the animals were just moving slower because of the cold. I kept going, looking for a good place to sit and wait. After a while, I found an elevation that gave me a partial view of a more open area. I decided that was the spot. I settled in and waited. The hours passed slowly, as always, and the cold started to weigh more. I was about to get up and move a bit to keep the blood flowing when something made me stop. In the middle of the clearing, between the trees, I saw movement. Something was there. I stood up slowly, trying to focus with my gun, but when I looked again, whatever it was, it had disappeared. I sighed, a little frustrated, and decided it was time to head back. It was already getting late, and I didn't want to lose daylight while trying to find the Jeep. I came down the elevation and started walking back. My mind was on autopilot as I followed the same tracks back to the starting point. The forest, still as silent as before, felt heavier now, but nothing that really alarmed me. After about an hour, I started to see the Jeep in the distance. An immediate sense of relief washed over me. But that relief didn't last long. As I got closer, I noticed something wrong. All 4 tires were flat. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had done this on purpose. At that moment, concern set in. I looked around, searching for any sign of movement, anything that could explain what was happening. But the forest remained still. There was no one there, at least not in sight. I tried to listen more carefully, but it was just silence. Nothing but that. I had no service and no way to get out of there. The discomfort turned into a wave of fear, because as isolated as I was, far from any civilization, the fact that someone had found the Jeep, slashed the tires, and disappeared without a trace was a disturbing thought. I went over to the vehicle, checked the damage. There was nothing to be done. Without the tires, I wasn't getting out of there. My mind started spinning with options. Walking back along the road until I got some signal or found help seemed insane. I was in the middle of nowhere, and the walk would be long. The other option was to try climbing a nearby elevation and see if I could get any signal from up there. Without thinking much, I decided on the second option. The risk of walking along the road was too great. I'd be exposed, not knowing who or what was out there, watching. I grabbed my backpack and prepared to head back into the forest, this time with my head more alert than before. As I moved away from the Jeep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. The silence that once seemed normal now felt suffocating. After leaving the Jeep behind, I walked quickly, trying to stay calm. The forest around me felt denser now. like the trees were closer than before. Everything felt darker. The idea that someone or something had been watching me the whole time bothered me, but I couldn't stop. I needed a plan. My goal now was to reach an elevation I remembered seeing earlier when I was exploring. If I could make it up there, maybe I'd find enough signal to make a call and get help, and hopefully I'd be far from whoever slashed the Jeep's tires. The path was rough, and the dry leaves on the ground made noise with every step I took. Typical of forests. I knew this could give away my location, but there was no way to avoid it. I kept going with my senses sharp, alert to anything, and that's when I started hearing it. It wasn't a loud noise, nor something that could be identified right away. It was more like the sound of leaves being trampled, but irregularly, as if someone was walking behind me, trying not to be noticed. I stopped suddenly, hoping that whoever was there would stop too and reveal themselves. But all I heard was silence. I kept walking, but now with a weight on my chest that I couldn't ignore. The feeling of being followed wouldn't leave my head. I decided not to look back right away, keeping my focus on the path ahead. If I seemed calm and unaware, maybe I'd buy some time. A few minutes passed and the sound of footsteps returned, closer now. I had no choice. I quickly turned my head and out of the corner of my eye saw something moving between the trees. It was fast, a shadow that disappeared before I could see what it was exactly. It just gave me more certainty that I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, almost running now. The top of the elevation was closer, and I knew I'd have an advantage there, even if only a slight one. The idea of being higher up made me feel a little safer. When I reached the highest point, I stopped to catch my breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I grabbed my phone and luckily there was a small signal. Not enough to make a call, but enough to send a text. I typed quickly, saying where I was and what had happened. I sent the message to my brother who knew I was on this trip. Maybe he could alert the authorities. As soon as I pressed send, the signal disappeared again, but I knew it had gone through. Now the question was how to get out of there without being found. I looked around trying to decide the best path. Walking straight back to the Jeep was too risky. Whoever was after me knew where the vehicle was and could be waiting for me. I decided to take a circular route, skirting the area, hoping to avoid any encounters. As I descended the elevation through a different path, I started to hear a new sound. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was heavier, something like wood being dragged or broken. It would stop and then start again, as if someone was carrying something large without much care. The sound came from far away, but it put me on alert. I tried not to focus too much on it. My priority was to get back to the Jeep, take a quick look around, and if it was safe, find some way to get out of there, maybe find someone on the road ahead. However, the way back was anything but peaceful. More than once I heard noises coming from different directions. It was clear that more than one person was following me. The urge to run was growing, but I knew that in the middle of the forest running could be a fatal mistake. I decided to keep a steady pace but alert to every movement around me. That's when, as I veered around a denser bush, I stumbled upon something that made me stop immediately. A small makeshift camp was there, almost hidden. There was a fire pit that looked like it had been put out recently, and logs arranged around it, as if a group had gathered there recently. But what really made me nervous was the feeling that this place was some sort of base for whoever was chasing me. I passed by the camp without touching anything, but the thought that I was walking in someone's territory made me even more tense. Now there was no doubt. Whoever they were, they had been there for a while, and I had been marked as a target from the start. Finally, after another hour of walking, I managed to spot the Jeep in the distance, in the same spot I had left it, with the tires still slashed. I looked around, trying to see if there was any sign of someone nearby. Nothing. The place was as quiet as before, but now the silence felt more threatening. I knew I had to act fast. My only chance was to try to inflate the tires with the repair kit I had in the trunk. Maybe that would give me enough time to get to a more populated area, or at least closer to some form of help. As I opened the trunk and started working on the first tire, I felt that uncomfortable sensation of being watched again. I didn't turn around immediately, but I knew someone was there. And this time I wasn't wrong. When I finally turned, I saw the silhouette of a person a few meters away between the trees. They didn't move, just stood there, watching me. The face was impossible to see because of the shadow of the trees, but I knew I was being evaluated, as if they were deciding what to do with me. My only option was to keep doing what I was doing, but now with the certainty that any wrong move could cost me dearly. I knew I didn't have much time. Whoever that person was standing between the trees, they were waiting for something. Maybe they were deciding whether to attack me or just keep tormenting me from a distance. There was no way to know. The only thing I could do was keep working on the tire, even with trembling hands and sweat dripping down my face, despite the cold that was starting to set in with the night. With every second that passed, the tension grew. The silence around me was heavy, interrupted only by the sound of the air compressor I was using to try to inflate the tire. I glanced at the silhouette, which hadn't moved. It was as if it was waiting for me to finish. Whatever it was, it seemed to have all the time in the world. After inflating the first tire, I stood up slowly, trying not to make any sudden moves. I grabbed the kit and prepared to start on the second tire when suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. It wasn't loud, but enough to make me freeze. Something, or someone, was closer now. I took a deep breath, and without turning around, kept working. I knew that any rash movement could trigger something I wasn't ready to face. The sound was getting closer, dry branches cracking underfoot. I was being surrounded. I finished the second tire, but I knew time was running out. There was more than one of them out there. Suddenly, I heard a muffled laugh coming from somewhere to my right. That was enough to make me decide. I had to get out of there. Now. I threw the compressor in the trunk and slammed the door shut, running to the driver's seat. The silhouette was still there, but now it had company. Two more figures emerged from the shadows, positioning themselves at the edge of the forest. They weren't running, just watching me, as if they knew I had nowhere to run. I started the Jeep's engine and sped off, even though I knew the tires weren't fully repaired. The Jeep wobbled but started to move, sliding through the mud and down the narrow trail. I could feel the car struggling with every pothole, but I kept my foot on the gas, not looking back. The fear of them chasing me was stronger than any caution. The way back seemed endless, the darkness around me only worsening the feeling that I was being followed closely. I could hear the engine growling, the tires fighting to keep the car moving. I was going slower than I wanted, but it was still better than staying there, at the mercy of whatever those people were planning. After a while, I finally managed to spot a more open area ahead. The main road wasn't too far, and I knew that if I made it there, I'd have a chance to find help or at least escape from that forest. But then, without warning, the Jeep started to lose speed. One of the tires couldn't handle the weight and pressure. The car wobbled and started to veer out of control. I tried to hold the steering wheel tight, but it was too late. The Jeep slid to the side and crashed into a tree, the impact throwing me against the seat. Pain took over my body for a second, but I knew I didn't have time for that. The Jeep was useless, and now I was again at the mercy of those hunting me. I unbuckled my seatbelt and got out of the vehicle as quickly as I could, staggering a bit as I tried to orient myself. The forest was silent again. No footsteps, no laughter, nothing. Just the sound of the wind and leaves rustling in the distance. But I knew they were there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to appear. The car was wrecked, and my only option now was to keep going on foot. I started running, not looking back. My legs felt heavy, and the pain in my ribs from the impact made it hard to breathe, but I couldn't stop. I knew it was only a matter of time before they appeared again. I was just a few meters from the main road when I heard the first footsteps behind me. It wasn't subtle this time. They were running, and fast. Fear gave me strength, and I kept running, fighting against exhaustion and pain. The streetlights from the road were in sight, but they seemed so far away, almost unreachable. Finally, my feet touched the asphalt, and I kept running, not looking to either side. I knew I couldn't stop there. I needed to find a vehicle, some kind of help. The lights of a car appeared in the distance, and I started waving desperately, hoping it would stop. The car slowed down and I ran toward it. This was my chance to escape. When the car door opened, the last thing I saw was the surprised look on the driver's face, who had no idea what was happening. I got into the car, begging him to drive, and finally I was safe. I didn't care where that man was going. The only thing that mattered to me was getting out of there as fast as possible. And thank God that's what happened. When I got home, the only thing I wanted was to forget that night, but it was impossible to forget. We're talking about an experience that nearly cost me my life, so it's clear that no matter how much I try, forgetting will be impossible.